Well, hi everybody and welcome. Glad you're able to join us today. In my last video, I referenced the book of Revelation. We talked about, the sign of the beast and all these things. And so I wanted to give you a book that supports what I had said there. Mystery Explained is the title. The author is David Campbell. And so if you want to find out more about how to read the book of Revelations in its context in which it was written and understand some of the things that are in there, I know that's been a difficult book, I think, for believers for many, many years, and I'm sure you'll find that to be a good and helpful read. Obviously the biggest problem in dealing with COVID is the virus itself, without a doubt. But that being said, the next biggest problem is that there isn't one narrative that everybody is like, yeah, that's the narrative. There's many narratives, many narratives, and just some observations about that. First of all, everybody has a narrative, and they're not all the same. There's a bunch of them. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. And every narrative, and this is something I've noticed, is that every narrative has an aspect to it that's incomplete. So in other words, it's like, okay, I think we should do this because it will solve this problem. And then you're like, okay, but this problem still exists. Or I think we should do this because it respects human rights. Yes, but what about these people's rights? And I just noticed that, try as we may, there's not like, okay, this narrative is absolutely complete. And that's why we're not all unified and on the same page. When you are in, and this is the other thing that's important, when you're in your narrative, whatever your narrative is, the temptation is thinking this way: I can't understand why everybody doesn't think like me. And I think that one is so easy to be into, where it's like, this is how I see the problem, this is how I see the solution. I just don't get these people that don't see things like I do. Here's another thought about that, and that is, when others don't have our narrative, there's the temptation to judge the motives behind their position. And I think this is very problematic. We can be tempted to look and say, oh, you're making this choice because of fear. Well, if you get into the fear thing, that can work for both sides. Or you say, well, you're not thinking of others, you're only thinking of yourself. Well, that may not be true at all. Or all sorts of other motive judgments that can be wrong and just totally miss it. So at any rate, what are some of the narratives? Let me just touch on some of the narratives that I've heard. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. I'm sure there's more, but I've heard narratives that go something like this. Well, the government is trying to, control us. This was all planned. Or the survival rate is very high, so what's all the fuss about? We need to do all that we can to stay at home whenever possible in order to, protect one another. I don't believe in vaccines, and here's why. And of course, there's a number of different answers that can be put there. I thank God for vaccines, and I believe that they're the way out of this mess. That's another narrative. This is all about my freedoms being taken away. That's the way I see this. My rights are being violated. That is my narrative. Another narrative is this: we need more restrictions to protect the vulnerable and stop the spread. Another one is this: we need, this is very recent, of course, vaccine passports, and looking at saying, well, we've got to put that in place. But then the other narrative is passports are segregating people, and that's wrong. Well, then there are narratives that are born out of people's experiences, where we have an experience and that becomes our narrative. And so perhaps this is your narrative. We got COVID, we recovered in a couple of weeks, no big deal. Or we got COVID, and you know what? My dad got hit with it really hard. Everybody else recovered, and it took him a few weeks to recover, whatever. Another one would be, I got COVID, and now I'm a long hauler. I'm dealing with damage to my lungs or to my heart, things of that nature. Or COVID is just like the flu. That's my experience, and that's what I think about it. And sadly, there are those that their narrative is someone in our family got COVID and they died. And that's a very, very sad position to be in. Or we're in need of an operation. This is another one. We're in need of an operation, and we keep getting delayed because of the number of COVID patients that are in the ICUs. We have a vulnerable family member, so we're going the extra mile with all of our precautions. And so there's all these narratives that are also born, not just out of like information and opinion, but out of their particular experience. Your narrative may not be my narrative, and it may not be your friend's narrative. In fact, it may not even be somebody else's narrative in your own family. But on top of that, there's other factors that play in, other influences that are there. One of them is cognitive bias, which is the propensity to only see things the way that we already believe that they are. And so it's kind of like the algorithm on social media. You know, you look something up, and then all of a sudden these other things are popping up that are related to what it was that you were looking for. And that's a little bit what cognitive bias kind of looks like, if you will. And so cognitive bias can cause us to sort of just always see things in one way. And then we can react when something is being said that is just in conflict with the narrative that we hold. The mistrust of media, the mistrust of government, you know, all of these things. And I just want to say this, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat when it comes to our narrative. You know, Paul wasn't dealing with a pandemic in the scriptures, but he was dealing with this sort of notion, everybody having their, if you will, version of the truth, and this development of camps, if you will, within the church. And Paul gives an appeal to unity by calling people back to a focus on Jesus. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10, he says, "Now I urge you, brothers and sisters, by the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you all agree and there be no divisions among you, but that you may be made complete and in the same mind and the same judgment. For I have been informed concerning you, my brothers and sisters, by close people, that there are quarrels among you. Now I mean this, that each one of you is saying, well, I'm with Paul, I'm with Apollos, you know, I'm with Cephas, or I'm with Christ." And then he says, has Christ been divided? So when Paul says, I want you to all agree, I want you to get along, here's what he doesn't do. He doesn't say, okay, we're going to sit around and debate Apollos, Cephas, we're going to debate these guys, figure this thing out, and all get on the same wavelength. That's not what he does. What he does is he says, look, we all have these different opinions, but let's all stay focused on what we all agree about, which is Jesus. So Paul's point was to say, this is what's central to our lives, and this is what needs to stay central to our lives, and that is Christ. Paul's message was simply this: don't let your opinion become the reason for division. Don't become so issue-centered that you stop being Christ-centered and, for that matter, acting Christ-like. There are many different viewpoints around the issue of COVID, and they should all be talked through, debated, wrestled with, reviewed, researched, the works. And even after doing all of that, there's a good chance that you wouldn't have 100% consensus. Obviously, that's what's going on right now. However, maturity demands that we have the capacity to not see eye to eye on things, and yet be able to be of one mind and one heart when it comes to what is central to our lives, which is Jesus. If our COVID narrative becomes divisive, then I'd submit to you that the devil just got a win. And that can happen, by the way, in a church, and it can also happen in families where people don't have the same narratives. Now, on September 21st, I was just doing what I normally do in the morning, spending time in prayer, had my prayer journal, that kind of thing. I wrote a thought down from the Lord, and it was this: can we have disagreement without division? Can we have disagreement without division? And this was the thought that came to me as I was spending some time in study. And when I wrote it down, I thought, that's a great question. I should probably study that out, and I thought maybe that's where I'll end up going with this. Let me move on. If our COVID narrative becomes reason for angry comments, hateful attacking words, gossip that accuses each other's motives and judges each other's intelligence, then we have a greater virus that we've let into our lives than COVID. We have a virus in our soul. I have long-standing friendships with people who I may strongly disagree with, but if they or their family were in some kind of need, I would be there in a heartbeat. The foundation of our friendship didn't shift over the introduction of a virus. Sadly, though, I, as well as probably others of you, have lost some relationships over issues that became more important than what is and what should stay central to our lives, which is Jesus. The difference in opinion about the narrative and the division that followed was simply a manifestation of valuing our opinion over valuing one another. There's plenty of space for disagreement, discussion, dialogue, and discourse, but there is no place for anger, hatred, offense, disrespect, and dishonor. Now, as I've considered it, I don't think that the sentence I wrote down that day was a question. I thought it was. I'll say it again. Can we disagree without division? I wrote that down. My first thought is, that's a question. That statement is actually not a question to be answered as I first thought. Rather, I believe it is a request to be followed. God's request to the church at this time is to live with your disagreement, but do so without division. And isn't that the spirit of this age? I mean, it happens all the time. Marriages get into disagreement, then they end in division. It's called divorce. Families get into disagreement, then they can break down with division. People now are not speaking to one another. And the question becomes, can we not have disagreement without division? Well, it's a request. It's God's request. I believe it's a call for maturity, getting our own way, having everyone else see our side, making our point of view being the mark of being awake to the real issue or some other, degrading expression isn't helpful to your relationships. Healthy families can argue, discuss, not agree, and still love each other and not be divisive against each other. And if you leave every relationship that you disagree with, you're going to end your life very alone. See, unity is very easy when we all agree. Hey, I'm for what you're for. I'm against what you're against. That is easy unity. But Christ's unity is this: I don't have to agree with you, and I can still be for you. In Luke chapter 6, verse 31, the Bible says to treat people the same way you want them to treat you. Philippians 2:4 says, do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. This verse has been quoted many times in reference to the pandemic about making choices that are taking into consideration others as we try not to spread the virus. Wear a mask, practice physical distancing, follow the Alberta healthcare guidance, getting vaccinated, all of these sorts of things. But I want to say this, don't just look out and take this verse in this sort of application, if you would. Don't just look out for your own narrative, but also the narrative of others. Be empathetic if you disagree. No matter what your narrative is, be empathetic towards others who may not agree with you and have the same narrative. Try to understand where others are coming from and the struggle of the decisions that they're facing. You may not agree. They may not change their position. You may not change your position either. But here's the request. Can you disagree without division?